Hey everybody, it's Tom Lynn coming to you somewhat later than usual this week. Apologies for that. I'm going to be discussing a book, Gödel's Proof, about Gödel's Proof by Ernest Nagel and James Newman. Their book came out in 1958, was edited and reissued in 2001 by, the editing was done by Douglas Hofstadter of Girdle Numbering fame. The proof was 1931, and formidable paper coming on the heels of work by two other people, Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead. That was a 3-volume work, Principia Mathematica. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up a little bit. Okay, the proof, Gödel's Proof by Kurt Gödel. That's really going to be our main focus for today. And I was thinking when I chose this book that it was going to sort of be a change up from what we've been doing in the previous weeks. We had Gaston Bachelard, and with him we had on the Poetics of Space, and we had Thomas Merton, some reflections from his On Love and Living. And in those two works we examined the emancipatory power of the poetic image, of the poetic mode, if you like, as bringing us to a condition of freedom, which then, in Merton's case, was connected to the term of love. And so, we're working in a certain sphere which one doesn't readily associate with the domain of the mathematical. And hence, when I chose this book, I thought, well, we're just going to, add some variety. But in fact, serendipitously, there is a thematic tie-in. That thematic tie-in has to do with creativity, imagination, and the ineluctable mystery of the universe. Exciting stuff. Now let's go ahead and check back with our good friend Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes, as you all are familiar with, probably wrote a little book, Discourse on Method, in which he really grounded the scientific project. But another major development for Rene was his introduction of a Cartesian plane, whereby he was able to assimilate the sphere of geometry to the sphere of algebra, and in this assimilation make the engagement of certain truths which thitherto have been rather awkward or accessible. And that played an important role subsequently in the development of, for example, Newtonian physics. That trajectory continued in the 19th century, along the kind of radicalizing trajectory, when it was demonstrated that the mathematical apparatus of algebra and what we sometimes term the infinitesimal calculus that had been developed by Newton and Gottfried Leibniz was demonstrated to be essentially an abstract expression of merely arithmetical principles, which, just as by converting geometric truths to algebraic truths and truths of calculus, by converting the truths of algebra and calculus to those of arithmetic or number theory, made the penetration of certain then thitherto impenetrable questions more possible. The next step in this process was to try to take number theory itself and reduce that to the terms of bare logic. And that's where Principia Mathematica came in, with Alfred North Whitehead and Bertrand Russell. And the hope was that by axiomatizing number theory and transposing it into an expression of merely logical truth, you would have a basis from which to deduce all mathematical truths. And given the intimate relationship that the mathematical language played in the natural sciences as they had evolved over the previous few centuries, the exciting possibility of taking that new deductive power and extending it to the sphere of nature itself. And all that played into a dream of clarity and certitude, which in a sense was inaugurated by the declaration of Rene Descartes in his Discourse on Method, where we could suddenly arrive at a place of clarity and certitude with regard to the truths of nature. And under the dispensation of the Enlightenment, in the particular relationship with truth that we inherit from that, the idea of being able to control nature and subject it to our own aspirations. Well, enter Kurt Gödel, who, in a brief but a difficult paper, suddenly revolutionized the world of mathematics by essentially demonstrating that this truth was perhaps not vainglorious, it might be overstating it, but was actually beyond the structural capacities of the method which was in the background of all these occurrences. That method is the method of axiomatization, where you take a certain fixed set of principles, which you accept, if you like, on faith, as your point of departure. And from that point of departure, then deduce the consequences. And so the example would be the truth of sentential logic. Sentence as in sense of sentences, where you could take certain propositions, P, Q, what have you, and you can take 4 axioms and put them together, and with those 4 axioms you can then derive all tautological theorems. And any given tautological theorem, tautology means something like A equals A, where you're saying the same thing twice, sometimes in different terms, but still essentially tautological. Like, if P, then it is the case that either P or P. We're getting off into abstract territory, so drawing back to the main line with Gödel. Okay. I mean, immense success with the axiomatic method, obviously, given, the powerful occurrences which had transpired in mathematics, had transpired in physics and the natural sciences and all the rest of it. But they were beginning to come up against certain barriers. And in a way, Gödel exposes us to how that might happen. In a true sort of act of genius, which was inspired by some prior people, such as a chap named Hilbert and another French mathematician, Reissued, who introduced some novel notions such as mapping on Reissued's part, and on Hilbert's part had introduced a method whereby to arrive at what Hilbert termed absolute proofs of consistency with regard to a given system. So sentential logic can be demonstrated to be both absolutely or consistent and complete, so that there's a transparent back and forth between the axioms and the theorems which are involved in that system. When Gödel engaged the Principia Mathematica, he realized that relationship of completion and consistency did not hold, or rather it held in an inverse way, such that if the Principia Mathematica was consistent, then it was necessarily also incomplete. Now, what does that mean? It means that even though the Principia Mathematica and the system which it provides us has immense power and use to help us look at certain aspects of number theory and their relationship with logical truths, nevertheless, it will never be able to access all of those truths. In fact, there's an infinite number of truths which obtain consistently with the nature of number, but which cannot be derived from the Principia Mathematica, despite the fact that the Principia Mathematica codifies the logical integuments or anatomy of number theory. The manner in which Gödel undertakes this is somewhat technical, but and the point of this book is to provide kind of thumbnail sketch that reduces that technicality to a minimum. And I would say by and large it succeeds. The only caveat here is that you're going to have to apply yourself. It's not quite as elementary as, a implies B, then B implies C, therefore A implies C. But the idea is that you can actually, this was the Gödel's sort of flourish. He introduced this concept of Girdle numbering, where he associated with every element or symbol of the Principia Mathematica a particular numeral. What he did was he arithmetized the Principia Mathematica. And then he formulated a theorem, which I'm going to read explicitly so that I don't mess it up. The theorem is I don't know if you guys are hearing that airplane. There is at least one formula for which no proposed sequence of formulas within the Principia Mathematica can prove. You then take that, which he expresses in symbolic logic, transpose it into arithmetic, and then illustrate that it obtains mathematically. That's very rough, okay? Which is why I would exhort you to simply go ahead and turn to the book itself. So, going on at some length here about the book, the background, the context. Hopefully I haven't lost you. If I have, sorry. Let's drive it back to what are the ramifications of this development for those of us who are perhaps, I shouldn't say those of us, but for those who are concerned with more than arid mathematical theory. What are some of the some of the uptakes of Gödel's proof? Well, I think that there are two big takeaways. The one which I sort of introduced at the outset, in that the innate incompleteness of the Principia Mathematica points to a fashion in which the domain of mathematics will be infinitely fertile as a ground from which to cultivate new insight, both as individuals and as a society. This in turn suggests that reality itself will be boundlessly fecund in that connection, that we will never be able to actually cast a net over the real so that we can control it. And that, to me, is both exciting and encouraging, and is a sort of point of connection with what the themes we were talking about in previous weeks: freedom, love, and so forth. More concrete takeaway has to do with the question of artificial intelligence. So, essentially, computers operate by unfolding the implications, the logical implications of a given set of directives, which means that they are, in a way, physical instantiations of the axiomatic method. And that's fantastic because the axiomatic method is powerful and helpful and so forth. But it also means that they, face the same limitations to the axiomatic method, such as those evidenced by Kurt Gödel's work. And that actually is the conclusion which is drawn by Ernest Nagel and James Newman, the original authors of the book. The editor of the book for the 2001 edition, waiting on this helicopter, Douglas Hofstadter, who you may have recognized his name again, as I mentioned, from the rather well-received book Erdel Escher Bach. Demures disagrees with that assessment. He believes that in two ways, right? On the one hand, he believes that whereas the axiomatic method represents one tact of sort of systematic reasoning, it's not the only tact of systematic reasoning, and that we can in fact program computers after a fashion which reflects some of these other approaches. And as such, he would then free the computer from the constraints of the axiomatic method. I respectfully disagree with Douglas at this point, because these other methods, which are sometimes more complicated, still ultimately can be reduced to an axiomatic framework. So you're looking at is a difference of complexity, but not a difference of epistemological contour or structure, essentially. I.e., it seems that computers are still subject to the constraint of a more or less axiomatic approach, even though we can, as human beings, apply and wield that approach in remarkably creative ways, thus creating the impression that something else is going on from the computer side. Look, for example, at chess programs. Okay, and the idea that, right now we're at a point where even moderately powerful chess programs are going to be capable of beating virtually any human being. But that's not in virtue of a natural or active intelligence within the program itself. It's in virtue of the circumstance that human beings wrote a code which reflected their own ability to marshal systems in a creative way. So the human element is actually what's primarily acting, though it's acting after a concealed fashion. The second manner, now, all that said, in which Douglas Hofstadter demurs from the conclusions of this book's authors, Ernest Nagel and James Newman, is that they believed that Gödel's work had demonstrated that no computer will ever really be able to mimic in a bona fide way the intellectual and really the creative power of the human brain. I say brain because they say brain as opposed to mind, and then you could get into some sticky stuff. What is brain, mind, and all the rest of it. Abstracting from that for the moment, if we can, it's the kind of thing that may just reassert itself. What Douglas Hofstadter does is say, well, actually, no, that's not the case, because the human brain itself is undertaking its ratiocination in a manner that reflects an ultimately systematizable approach, and that is an approach of analogy as opposed to, say, deduction. Again, I'm going to differ from Hofstadter here in, I suppose, two respects. One being that, obviously there's an analogical reasoning which occurs within the human person, and obviously there are patterns and tendencies that we can identify. But I think it's an error to believe that those can be exhaustively mapped so that all of a sudden we understand the human person. That's sort of from the objective side of the question. The subjective side of the question is that what is left out, in my view, of Hofstadter's approach to the matter is the role of the subject, of the consciousness on the other side of the reasoning process. So even if you go ahead and say that we can take reasoning, whether deductive or analogical, and marshal it as simply the expression of a certain rigid framework, the human being is actually something apart from that reasoning process. The human being is an agent which is enacting that process and is apart from it. And that is in that space of that enactment that there is a genuine and irreducible creativity. That genuine and irreducible creativity is something which I really don't think can ever be ultimately mimicked by a machine or a computer. The resolution of this question turns upon a scrutiny of what do we mean by consciousness itself, which is really something outside of the scope of today's video. But hopefully these remarks are sufficiently evocative that you guys will go out and get a copy of Gödel's proof. Mr. Hofstadter's done a good job of editing it, and thank you to Ernest Nagel and James Newman for providing the service of liaisons to Gödel's original paper. And I have to say, I apologize. I haven't talked more about Kurt Gödel himself. Maybe I'll do a little video just on him, because truly a remarkable genius. He was actually a very close friend to Albert Einstein, and I think maybe I'll talk about that and some of his other work as well. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thanks for bearing with me here for 20-some minutes, and I apologize for the tardiness. It's a bit of a naughty piece of mathematical reasoning here that we've got from Kurt, and I exhort you all to go check it out. Anyway, this has been Tom Lynn, and I'll catch you guys next week. And I don't know which book I'm going to do, to tell you the truth. I might do Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, or there's a fine little screed by this guy Chogyam Trungpa, The Sacred Path of the Warrior, but the essence of courage being vulnerability. So we'll see what I end up doing. All right, guys, thanks, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.